rich man's world. I have turned the soul.
Welcome to the Faking It podcast. I'm here with Dr. Lembke. She is a professor of psychiatry at Stanford School of Medicine and the chief of the Stanford Addiction Medicine Dual Diagnosis Clinic. Dr. Lembke has recently appeared on the Netflix documentary The Social Dilemma. She's a specialist in the opioid epidemic and the author of many books, including her latest New York Times bestselling book, Dopamine Nation, Finding Balance in the Age of Indulgence. Super awesome. You're like really incredible. I met you when you came and talked in my class in psychology, introduction to psychology. And I just remember being so enthralled by everything that you were saying, so engaged, and also the way that you just talk and like your persona and everything about you is so cool. So I read your book, totally loved it, and just wanted you to come onto my podcast and talk to my audience. So thank you for coming on.
Oh, you're very welcome. Thank you for those kind words, and I'm excited to be here.
Cool. So I was wondering if we could dive into your latest book and like your research around addiction and dopamine in particular. And just to let everyone know what dopamine is, maybe you can give a little, just talk about like what dopamine is and why it matters. Like, why is this a topic of a book that you've written?
Yeah, sure. So dopamine is a brain neurotransmitter, which means that it's a chemical that we produce in our brain. It's essential for the experience of pleasure, reward, and motivation. It's also important for movement and has other functions as well. And it's central to understanding how we become addicted. So the changes in dopamine over time that occur in the brain in response to repeated ingestion of a substance or repeated engagement of a behavior are what eventually lead to the pathophysiology that we consider to be the brain disease of addiction.
Okay, and what does that mean in layman terms for like a person who doesn't have any addiction? How do they get affected by dopamine? Because I know we get dopamine rushes when we eat a bar of chocolate, for example, so like what does that look like in our day-to-day lives?
Well, I mean, dopamine is essential for our function and for our survival, right? It's the neurotransmitter that tells us this is something that we should do again. And it's also key to knowing what's new or novel in the environment. So not even just things that are pleasurable, but things that are generally things that we should pay attention to. And it feels good when we release dopamine, presumably. Because what we know from animal experiments and also in humans is that things that generally feel good, things that are intoxicants or just rewarding more broadly, are things that release more dopamine in a dedicated part of the brain called the reward pathway. But what can happen over time as we continue to stimulate this part of our brains is that our brains adapt or compensate by downregulating dopamine production and transmission, not just to baseline tonic levels of dopamine firing, but actually below baseline into something we call the dopamine deficit state. And with enough exposure to reinforcing substances and behaviors, we can kind of get stuck in that dopamine deficit state, which is akin to addiction, as well as feels like depression, anxiety, irritability. We've essentially changed then our hedonic or joy threshold, where we need more of the reinforcing substance and behavior in larger quantities and more potent forms, not then to get high and feel good, but just to bring us out of that dopamine deficit state and feel normal. And when we're not using, we're walking around in a state of craving, mental preoccupation, experiencing the universal symptoms of withdrawal from any addictive substance, which are anxiety, irritability, insomnia, dysphoria, and intrusive thoughts of wanting to use.
So just to explain, so you're saying that dopamine is what helps us feel good in general, kind of just gives us pleasure. It's pleasurable to feel it. And so when you take some sort of drug that makes you feel good, that increases your dopamine, like for example, heroin, which I think you wrote is like eating a bar of chocolate, it's like 55% of like a dopamine rush. Sex is like 100%. Heroin is 1,000% of release of like dopamine. And so,
so actually not heroin. It was actually amphetamine.
Okay.
But yeah. I mean, you have to be a little bit, careful about over interpreting those data to mean that, amphetamine is 1,000 times more addictive than chocolate, because part of that is artifactual. Amphetamine, the mechanism of action is to release dopamine into the synapse. So you're going to get high dopamine readings from amphetamine, whereas other reinforcing substances and behaviors also release dopamine, but they do it as a kind of downstream effect after a different kind of chemical cascade.
Right.
The other thing, too, is that there's this whole concept of drug of choice, right? So what might release a lot of dopamine in your brain might not release a lot of dopamine in my brain, and vice versa. From an evolutionary perspective, that kind of makes sense. We wouldn't want everybody going for the same exact reinforcing goods. We would want it spread out across the tribe. But, as generally speaking, dopamine works as a kind of common currency for substances and behaviors that are reinforcing. Now, I probably need to qualify this one step further. There's often a debate around whether dopamine is more important for liking something or the pleasurable aspect, or more important for wanting something or the motivation to get it.
Right.
And it's important for both is the answer. So it looks like, dopamine is important for the experience of pleasure, but also dopamine drives the willingness of the organism to work to try to get that reward, especially in that dopamine deficit state. There's a very famous experiment where rats were engineered to have no dopamine receptors in the reward circuits of the brain. And scientists discovered that if you put food in the rat's mouth, it would eat the food, seem to get pleasure from the food. But if you put it even a body length away, that the rat would starve to death. This idea being that we need dopamine in order to be willing to be motivated to do the work to get the reward.
Right. So it doesn't just invoke or give us pleasure in the act. It also makes us want to embrace pleasure as well, whatever that pleasure be, whether it's eating food or etc. And then also one thing that, sorry, do you want to say something?
Oh, I was just going to say, so initially, exposure to any intoxicant or reinforcer is pleasurable. But again, the key piece here is that over time, that initial upward spike in dopamine gets weaker and shorter, but that after response or that dopamine deficit state gets stronger and longer. That's how the brain attempts to balance out.
Right. So there's this idea of like homeostasis that you talk about a lot in the book, where if you get repeated exposure to something that's pleasurable, it's not going to be as pleasurable, but you'll still get that negative side of it the same amount. And so it still just hurts as much, but you need more of whatever that dopamine is when it comes to like certain drugs. And I think that's one really interesting distinction too that you're making, that dopamine, you have certain drugs that just release dopamine. These are like the methamphetamines that you're talking about. Then you have certain acts that you like that are subject to just you. Like I love white chocolate, and therefore when I eat white chocolate, it tastes so good. It gives me so much pleasure, as opposed to my mother who doesn't, like let's say doesn't like white chocolate. Right. And so that's where it's dependent on. So you mentioned in your book, you talk about this idea that we're in a dopamine like society economy. And you talk about David Courtwright, a historian, who calls our economy Olympic capitalism, where we have pleasure at our fingertips, speedy satisfaction, high potency drugs, all these different things. So this to me sounds like something that's not like not like these drugs that are built to release dopamine, but rather things in our economy that we just like, that are subject to us, that then release dopamine. How does that affect us as a society? Just having access to, Amazon instant deliveries, social media, constant entertainment at our fingertips, not necessarily a drug that releases dopamine, but just activities that just make us feel good. So how is that affecting us?
Yeah. So I think you're, drawing an important connection between sort of the classic drugs that people think about, things like nicotine, cannabis, and alcohol, and stimulants like methamphetamine or opioids. And everybody kind of knows, oh yeah, you can get addicted to those. But really anything that's reinforcing, that makes us, experience some degree of reward or pleasure that we want to then experience again, has the potential to become addictive. So we can get addicted to behaviors as well as substances. And then importantly, in this kind of dopamine economy that we live in now, we've sort of, biohacked the motivational and rewarding aspects of almost every type of human behavior and made it more reinforcing, more plentiful, more potent, more novel. So whether it's playing a game or connecting with other humans or eating food or going shopping, all of that has effectively been turned into a drug, making us all more vulnerable to getting addicted to these kinds of everyday experiences that infuse our lives.
And where does the pain come into this? Because I know that you're saying that our neural point for pleasure gets higher and higher the more that we're exposed to something. So how does pain play a role? And like, is it that we need to be on social media for longer in order to get the same feeling of like relaxation from social media? Or like, where does pain play a role, or our threshold to pleasure play a role? And how does that affect our society?
Yeah. So the metaphor that I like to use for that is that of a balance. So imagine something like a board on a central fulcrum or a teeter-totter, which represents how we process pleasure and pain. Pleasure and pain are co-located in the brain. So the same parts of the brain that process pleasure also process pain, and they work like opposite sides of this balance. There are certain rules governing this balance, and the first and most important rule is that it wants to remain level, or what neuroscientists call homeostasis. And the way that it remains level after any deviation to pleasure or pain is first by tilting an equal and opposite amount to whatever the initial stimulus is. So if we eat a piece of chocolate, that releases dopamine in the reward pathway. Our pleasure-pain balance tilts to the side of pleasure. But no sooner has that happened than we essentially tilt an equal amount to the side of pain. I like to think of that as these neuroadaptation gremlins hopping on the pain side of the balance to bring it level again, but they like it there. So they stay on until we're tilted an equal and opposite amount to the side of pain. That's that moment of wanting one more piece of chocolate, wanting to watch one more TikTok video, wanting to, smoke one more joint, have one more glass of wine. We can even experience that craving and that come down while we're still ingesting, that first substance or engaging in that first behavior. And in a world of scarcity where it's really hard to find these reinforcers, well, we're going to not have the ability when we're in that, on the pain side of the balance to reach for more. And so we're going to have to just wait it out, and the gremlins will hop off and homeostasis will be restored. And then we'll, do some more work to look for more of that reward. But in this world of overwhelming abundance, where we have access to almost every reinforcer at the touch of our fingertips, it's actually very hard not to ingest more of that substance. And that's one way to accelerate the return to homeostasis, right? I have a piece of chocolate, I get pleasure, and then I tip to the side of pain, those gremlins. Now, I could wait for them to hop off and then homeostasis will be restored. But on the other hand, I could grab for 2 pieces of chocolate and that will bring me, level again. So of course, we all have the urge to do that. Because again, this driving physiologic drive to kind of go back to the level position is very, very strong in all living organisms. And that's essentially the process. Then with repeated exposure, that initial deviation to pleasure gets weaker and shorter, but that after response gets stronger and longer. In other words, those gremlins start to multiply. Pretty soon they're camped out there. And now we're walking around in this chronic dopamine deficit state, where we need enormous quantities of pleasure to feel any pleasure at all or just feel normal. And when we're not using, we're in pain.
Where is the homeostasis there, though? Because why doesn't the pleasure stay pleasurable, and why does the pain get stronger? Why doesn't that happen in the opposite sense too?
Well, it can, but again, if we expose ourselves to the same reinforcer, the same substance or behavior that was initially released dopamine or something similar, the way that the balance works, and this has been, shown across, many different studies, is that over time we develop tolerance. So we need more and more of that drug to get the same effect. So that initial deviation to pleasure just gets weaker and shorter, but that after response is stronger and longer. So we tilt deeper and deeper and deeper down on the pain side, more and more gremlins. If you're asking why would Mother Nature be so cruel as to make a balance that does that? Yes,
that's what I'm asking.
Right. Well, it has to do with survival in a world of scarcity and ever-present danger, which is the world that human beings have lived in, for most of our existence. If you think about a world like that, where we were, evolved to traverse, 10 to hundreds of kilometers in some cases a day in order to just find food, water, and shelter, what better way to get us to do that than to make every pleasure fleeting and to have it be followed in its aftermath by pain, such that we're motivated, even more motivated to keep seeking. And that really makes us very, very driven to continue to look for those rewards. But it is a terrible system for the world that we live in today, this world where we've sort of changed our ecosystem such that, pleasures are readily available wherever we turn. They're very potent. They're very abundant. They're novel. They're easily available, all of which makes it a very difficult environment for us to thrive.
Yeah. So this scale, this pleasure pain scale that gets tipped when you have some pleasure, then tipped back to the level of pain, is it strictly temporal? So is this something that if, let's say you have that second craving, you want more chocolate, let's say you have an eating disorder and you feel like you're in a binge, or like that's an extreme example and technically an addiction to food in that moment.
That's right.
So is this just something that to get over that feeling, is it solely temporal where time heals homeostasis, like homeostasis just takes time? Is that the only factor?
So with enough brain plasticity, we do believe that abstinence from the drug of choice is the secret to restoring homeostasis. So yes, leaving enough time between binging, for example, on highly processed, highly fatty, sugary, salty foods would be the way to restore homeostasis. Food is an especially interesting example because, of course, we're not talking about not eating food, right? We're talking about not eating drugified food. It's drugified food that gets us in this vicious cycle of craving. So when we work with people who have food addiction, and many people, who have been conceptualized as having eating disorders, really it's not about body image per se. It's more about the kind of anesthetized state they can achieve either through binge eating or restricting, or binging and vomiting, or binging and laxatives. So we try to get them to abstain from that particular behavior, either purging or ingesting the drugified foods for long enough so that those neuroadaptation gremlins get the signal, oh, wait a minute, I'm not getting these huge dopamine hits externally from drugified food. So now I'm getting just healthier food that I need to make my body function. So those gremlins then hop off and eventually homeostasis is restored.
Right. That's really interesting because also in your book, you talk about the importance of changing behavior to prevent addiction, not just by taking certain medications, Do you want to talk a little bit about that in terms of just medicine, how medicine plays a role in pain and also how it isn't always the sole answer to creating change for somebody?
Are you talking about like psychotropics? Is that what you're asking about? Things like antidepressants or anxiolytics or what?
Yeah, we can start there. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, the past 50 years or so, well, maybe more like 30 years have been sort of a grand social experiment in which we have given things like selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, Prozac, Paxil, Zoloft, Celexa, or anxiolytics like Xanax, Ativan, Valium, or mood stabilizers, what have you, to people with diagnosed mental health conditions, anxiety, depression, other mood disorders, all in the spirit of trying to help them and help stabilize their moods. But really, we don't really know, what's happening, and we don't really know the long-term effects and only now are we really seeing some of the potential more subtle downsides. But essentially what we're doing with that is we are gently pressing on the pleasure side of the balance. There is some degree of neuroadaptation, although it typically happens very slowly. The result being that for most people who are taking antidepressants, they don't develop an addiction to it, and it continues to work over time, which is the good news. For psychotropics like benzodiazepines, Xanax, Ativan, Valium, Klonopin, those are addictive, and tolerance develops quite quickly. And in a relatively short amount of time, they will usually stop working, although patients tell us, oh, it still feels like it's working, what they're probably doing is just medicating withdrawal from the last dose and not the underlying disorder. So they're just kind of keeping a level balance in between, but ultimately adding more gremlins to the pain side, which is why we don't recommend using those types of medicines long term. Getting back to the antidepressants, there are also potentially some subtle costs that are maybe not widely recognized. Just things like people losing some of their emotional bandwidth. Yeah, not getting as sad or as anxious, but maybe also not experiencing some of the profounder emotions like awe and grief, or profound joy because of the kind of ceiling and floor effects of those medications. I want to emphasize that I prescribe psychotropics every clinic day. They can be life-saving. This is not a message about, not using medicines appropriately prescribed to the right person by somebody who understands the risk, benefits, and alternatives are a really important tool, but they are often overprescribed. People can get addicted to certain types of psychotropics, especially stimulants and benzodiazepines. So I think, people have to be sort of wary consumers.
Right. And I thought something that you said that was very interesting was you brought up this example of a woman who got gastric bypass surgery. And then there's a stat that 1 in 4 people who have the surgery develop alcohol addictions because there isn't really that practice for behavioral change of just like an addiction to something, despite bodily help that they're getting, whether it's medicine or whether it's surgery. Do you want to talk a little bit about that? That was kind of like what I was thinking too, is how the importance of like behavior with medicine is important. Yeah. Which I think we can talk about. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's a really great point. When we attempt to change these complex, ingrained, repetitive behaviors with a surgical intervention or a pill, that can be helpful, but on the other hand, we're also potentially bypassing, no pun intended, in the development of learned behaviors, more adaptive learned behaviors. And the result can be that sort of quick intervention with a pill or a surgical procedure can work for a time, but isn't necessarily going to be the best solution in the long run. In the long run, it's really better to change behaviors, change the environment, change the interaction between behaviors and environment so that we develop new neural circuits that allow us to really have more adaptive and healthy coping strategies over the long haul. This is true, potentially true with people who have, severe eating disorders and obesity, as well as, for example, people with attention deficit disorder, who are often prescribed stimulants, but really might be better off not taking stimulants and instead learning better focus strategies. I will say, however, that part of the problem here is that we do live in this, incredibly drugified ecosystem where it's very difficult, for example, to eat healthy food because unhealthy food is everywhere. And so, when you look at that mismatch between somebody's physiology and the world we live in some cases, the ability to do a surgical intervention or help them with a medication really may be compassionate intervention, especially then when combined with a behavioral intervention. So it doesn't have to be either or, is kind of what I'm saying. We can combine behavioral interventions with these surgical and pharmacological tools when indicated.
Right. But does that mean that they're not mutually exclusive? So you can sometimes do one, sometimes do the other, and sometimes do both? Or would you say that both is important to help somebody get over some sort of addiction?
I would say that it depends on the person. For some person, for some people, that behavioral intervention will be best. For others, a pharmaceutical intervention or a surgical intervention really may be best for them. Or really, when you have the most severe cases, it's a combination of the two. And in general, my bias leans toward psychosocial and behavioral interventions, just because every medical, pharmaceutical or surgical intervention is going to have potential risks associated with it, which can be avoided, if you are engaging in the behavioral intervention.
Right. Yeah. And then something that you talked about too in the book that has to do with like this idea of just feeling good, pleasure in our society is how like kids are kind of being sheltered in a sense and how that may be hurting them to some degree. Do you want to talk about this? Because I personally like really enjoyed reading that because I do think that that's something that is happening in our society. But for some reason, I feel like it's controversial to say that, to say that like it's okay to be, to talk about something that could be hurtful to somebody or could just trigger us in some way. Like, what are your thoughts on this in particular? Yeah.
Yeah. So, I always want to tread lightly here because my message is not that Gen Zers are sort of coddled necessarily or spoiled or weak or, whatever it is. That's not really the message at all. It's more that Gen Zers are the recipients of about 120 years of evolving mental health concepts that really began with Freud, this idea that our early childhood experiences shape future psychopathology, even at the level of the unconscious. This is Freud's great contribution. I may not even be aware of, some of the serious and even, let's say, traumatic events that I endured as a child that are now contributing to my adult suffering. So this is Freud's idea. The problem is that over about the last 120 years, this has progressed to the point where people are now, and I say people, not just Gen Zers, in general, as a culture, there's a narrative that suggests that any kind of distress, disease, challenge, or hardship is going to set us up for future psychopathology. And that was never that was never Freud's original intention or message. That's just somehow what's happened to that message over time. Such that now, parenting is infused with this idea that we have to sort of protect our kids and make sure they're comfortable. And if they're going to fail a class or not get on the team or not get a part in a play, that's going to be devastating for them. We need to intervene and help them get those things because otherwise they'll be overwhelmed with sadness and distress. And this is all going to then make them, turn into depressed and anxious adults. But in fact, there's a tipping point here, right? There's a tipping point at which too much trauma is not a good thing, but too little trauma is also probably not a good thing. That there's some happy medium where we do need enough challenge and distress and experience of failure and enough awareness of our shortcomings in order to be able to function as successful adults. And that contrary to the idea that a hardship in our life is always going to result in some kind of adult psychopathology, what's very true is that overcoming hardship in our lives can often be a touchstone to help build our confidence that we can then endure future hardship. And I think this is what we really have to remind ourselves of because we've somehow forgotten it.
Yeah, I think that's so interesting that we hit a point where not everybody, obviously, but a lot of people don't face those kinds of hardships, which is why I think it makes sense. And in a high-class society, people are so depressed because maybe they don't have this like idea that they have so much, and that they should be happy because they don't know what it's like to not have what they have already. So what do you do about this? Like, I know that I remember I was sitting in a plane once and I was talking to this woman and she asked me about my past and I told her I grew up in this religious community and she told me, she's like, I'm very wealthy and I don't know how to raise a son who is going to be grateful for what he has. Do you have any advice for me? And I said, no, send him to Africa. Like, I don't know, like, what are your thoughts on how to help people be grateful at the end of the day or build that resilience and know that what they have is enough? So we don't have to strive for more pleasure since we already are experiencing so much.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I want to be a little bit careful with this trope, send somebody to Africa, right? Africa is a varied country with, a lot. I think we don't want to, that's probably not the best example. But your overall point is
you're right.
Yeah. Your overall point, though, is well taken, which is just simply that, we're, as a society, both individually and collectively, we are facing a new kind of challenge today, which is the challenge of having so much, what I sometimes refer to as the plenty paradox, where plenty and overabundance itself becomes a source of actual physiologic stress and suffering. So, what I advocate for is a kind of new form of asceticism where we intentionally create barriers between ourselves and the many intoxicants that are inviting us daily, and instead try to simplify our lives, try to consume less, and even intentionally try to do things that are hard. This is things like exercise, ice cold water immersion, cleaning out our closets, intermittent fasting, ordering directly from the barista instead of using an app, writing a thank you note saying we're sorry. All of these things that take effort, that are not immediately gratifying, but which, in their sum make for, happier, I would say, and more rewarding life. And if you look at the neuroscience of that, there's a whole branch of science called hormesis. Hormesis is a Greek word that means to set in motion. And essentially what hormesis has shown is that when an organism is exposed to mild to moderate doses of not toxic or noxious, painful stimuli, that actually makes the organism more resilient, more robust, faster, stronger, you name it. The key is to get the right amount of the toxic stimuli. If it's too little, it won't work. If it's too much, the organism will be injured. So we're not talking about self-harm or cutting. We're talking about kind of that in-between sweet spot, that right-sized amount of pain or difficulty that allows us to be more resilient and more robust, and ultimately to get our dopamine indirectly. Because when we press on the pain side of the balance, those neuroadaptation gremlins are happy to go over and hop on the pleasure side of the balance as a way to restore homeostasis. So ultimately, we are changing our hedonic or joy set point to the side of pleasure by doing things that are hard in the first place.
Yeah, when I read that, I remember I was going to a yoga class the next day, and in the yoga class we were stretching, and I had to stretch my shin, and I was like, oof. Then I was remembering what you said about how being in a little bit of pain can actually enhance pleasure overall. And so I thought about that. I was more intentional about how does my body feel when I'm inflicting this small amount of stretching pain on my legs, And I did realize after holding it for a second, holding that stretch for 15, 20 seconds, I felt this release of pleasure through my body. It was very physical. I noticed it, because I was really trying to pay attention. I was like, whoa, this is actually happening. This is real. And it was really cool to
that's great.
Pay attention to that. Yeah.
That's great to hear. A lot of, I will often counsel people around the opposite, that think about when you're on, how you feel when you're using TikTok or social media. And then right when you put it away, notice that come down, right? That dopamine free fall, that sort of anxious, restless, sad quality that encroaches. We are literally, in dopamine free fall. So again, is it worth it, right? Is it really worth it when you kind of go through the whole process of seeing that sort of secondary effect?
Totally. And it makes sense that you get that fall, because it's kind of right now you're experiencing just life, whatever that is. And then you have your pleasure, you have your pain, it's kind of balanced out. And the second you uplift that, then that's your new state of normal. So when you go back down, it's worse than where you were for that millisecond, 5 seconds, 20 seconds, hour of social media, But then if you're here for a while, then that's why that becomes the normal, because then you have to go up one more level to then experience that push. So that's why I guess it makes sense that you have to keep on either staying where you're at, working with the balance to keep it there. All right. I guess one last thing I'd love to talk about is how to get over these addictions. I know you kind of talked about it with abstinence, with getting rid of something. I know for me recently, I decided to try this out with my phone. I went on an 8-day no phone challenge. Oh, wow. Which is kind of crazy. Yeah.
Great.
It's pretty insane. Yeah. Especially because I'm an influencer. So if I can do it, I really do think anybody can do it. I bought a new phone like it was $30 on Amazon that just had a SIM card that was for emergencies. I didn't give the number to anyone except my mom. She made me give it to her. But yeah, I was only for emergencies, just in case like I need to dial 911, and I was off my phone for 8 days. And I went through the cycles of like addiction. I was like irritable when I was eating food. I couldn't relax, it was weird. It was really crazy.
Yeah.
But eventually after 8 days, I did feel calm. And even now I'm at like the office where I work every day, and I don't bring my phone here. I just bring my camera to get content. So I followed the next sense. I did some experimenting, and now I'm like hitting a space where I'm comfortable. I don't know if everyone can do this no phone challenge to stop phone addictions. I can't really tell people to do that. But what are ways that aren't as extreme, if that's possible, for people to break out of these like social media habits, phone habits, daily addictions of our society? If you have any advice for people there.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I love that you did that. Good for you. That's not easy.
Thank you.
You planned for it, which was a smart thing. So what we recommend is we do recommend a dopamine fast. Figure out what your drug of choice is, and digital devices. So we're all at least a little bit addicted. So if you can eliminate the device itself, like you did for a period of time, that's the best. If you can't get rid of the device altogether, then think about deleting apps or not going on the websites or whatever your drug of choice is, right? That thing that once you start, you have difficulty stopping. That thing that you said repeatedly you would cut back and you haven't been able to. That thing that's interfering with your goals and values. Identify what that is. Plan to quit it for a period of time. Make sure that you set it up for success. So like you did, you got another flip phone so you would be reachable. You told people in your intimate circle that you were going to be available in a different way.
Right.
And then essentially on your quit date, create barriers between yourself and your drug of choice. So I assume that you didn't leave your phone out handy somewhere for where you would go walk by it every time. Right. I assume you turned it off and powered it down. You hid it, right? Or had somebody else hide it. Or I've had patients actually put it in a Bank of America safe or what have you.
Wow.
And then be prepared for the symptoms of withdrawal, because the universal symptoms of withdrawal from any addictive substance or behavior, in addition to whatever physical symptoms of withdrawal we may be having, the universal psychological symptoms are anxiety, irritability, insomnia, depression, and intrusive thoughts of wanting to use. And our brain is really good at coming up with stories or narratives as to why it's really important that I check my phone, even though I committed, to not doing it. And that can be things like my kids will need to come, or my mom's going to need, or this person's in trouble. So all kinds of, we'll come up with sort of like altruistic reasons or, really good sounding things, but it's really just rationalization. Right. And then, observe how after the acute withdrawal starts to dissipate, notice what you're feeling. Are you feeling less preoccupied with that stimulus? Are you feeling less irritable, less anxious? What we see a lot of is folks coming in who want help with depression and anxiety. 20 years ago, I would have given them an antidepressant. Now what I recommend is a dopamine fast, typically for 4 weeks, because that's on average the time it takes to reset reward pathways for most people who are addicted. Of course, everybody's different, and a week might be enough, especially for a young person. But in general, it takes minimum 4 weeks. And 80% of folks will come back at the 4-week point if they've been able to abstain, reporting vast improvements without or having done anything else. So just by stopping with the constant, stimuli that release dopamine, they allow their brain's time to start to make their own, upregulate their own dopamine threshold again, and people feel a lot better. And then it's a matter of, okay, after the dopamine fast, what now? Because obviously, especially with devices, they're so integrated into our lives. And then we talk about a specific plan. When are you going to use how much, how often? And what I really like that you've done, which I think we need a lot more of, is you now leave the house without your phone, which makes people really, really anxious. But it's completely doable. And I think it's key. There's a lot of like, well, I'm going to monitor my use or I'm going to delete this app. But what we need to do more of is actually leaving the portable device, right? So we're not, it's not with us and occupying us and calling to us, right? Actually getting physical distance from it for some period of time every day. I think that's the way that we're going to get to a healthier relationship with this technology, because that's what it's about. It's not about getting rid of the technology. It's about how can we have a healthier relationship with the technology.
I think for me, definitely abstaining from using my phone taught me that I can be without my phone. For, I don't think I would have been able to make that like logical leap to just say, oh, I'll leave it at home, and I'll only use it when I'm there.
Right.
I wouldn't have thought of that because I wouldn't have, I had to just go cold turkey to even know that, oh, it's possible for me to be without my phone. Like now I know this is okay.
Right.
Which is interesting too, I think.
Yeah. So that comes up a lot. People say, well, can't I, if my ultimate goal is to just use less, can't I just cut back? And there are two problems with that. The first problem is it's actually a lot harder to reduce use than it is to just quit use for a period of time. The other thing is that if we just reduce and we don't quit, we really don't reset reward pathways. We're always in kind of sub-threshold withdrawal. Whereas if we quit, we go into significant withdrawal, but then our brain goes, oh, okay, I'm not getting this thing. I got to start making my own, upregulating dopamine. And then we get to a place where we really feel better and we're able to take joy in more modest rewards. And then many people don't want to go back to using their drug or their digital devices the way that they were. They feel so much better that they really are motivated then to have a much different relationship.
Yeah, and that kind of just reminds me of what you talked about towards the end of your book about how creating strict guidelines, like for the AA, really helps people adhere to these, the rules because they're so strict. There's no like gray area. There's no like, sometimes it's fine. This limitation is okay. Because then when you have these limitations, they end up being more malleable as opposed to yes and no, which in general humans prefer, I guess, just the niceties of black and white of like 1 or 0. It's just easy on our mind.
Yes.
Which is very interesting.
Yeah. That's true. That's true.
Yeah. Cool. Thank you so much for coming on. I would say my biggest takeaway from your whole book is about the idea of delayed gratification and how that really helps us be happy as people and grateful for what we have. And now you're right. It's so easy in our society to just constantly get pleasure. But when you work for that pleasure, that's when it truly feels good when you put that work in. And so that's like one thing I want everyone listening to really take away from this is that if they're not feeling grateful or they don't feel like they're getting the pleasure they want in their life, to participate in acts of writing thank you notes, like you said, going up to work to get that coffee instead of hitting a button on your phone, talking to somebody to get it, like just putting in that little work to get something, I think, like you said, just goes a really long way and makes us happier for longer.
Yeah. Putting a little more friction in there.
Friction. Yeah. Cool. Well, thank you so much for coming on to my podcast. I really appreciate you sharing these messages.